Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today, we're going to be talking about the new album from Ayreon, titled The Theory of Everything. It is one of the most ambitious and fascinating projects ever undertaken in metal. Hell, some could make the argument it's one of the biggest in music as a whole. It's the brainchild of a genius, singer-songwriter, multi-instrumentalist with a love of prog rock, psychedelia, and science fiction. A project that has spanned dozens of metal acts, big and small. For me, it's been the introduction point to so many bands which I have consequently discovered and loved. And the fact that something coherent and engaging could have been made from so many very different acts and bringing them all together, it's mind-boggling. Yeah, folks, I'm talking about Ayreon, the multi-album mega project masterminded by Arion. Started in 1995 by The Final Experiment, the Ayreon story as it was spanned 7 albums, all of which are good and a few are goddamn classics. In that regard, it's a little hard for me to be heavily critical of this project, partially because it plays such a huge role in my discovery of progressive metal, and partially because it's so goddamn awesome. I guess if I was going to try here, Arion's closest analog in another field would be that of Kenneth Branagh, in that both men are fiendishly ambitious, produce highly cerebral material that can occasionally toe the line between being epic and being kind of campy, and that they both have surprising and unbelievable clout in their ability to recruit players from all across the field of their industry. Do you want a short list of the bands from which Arion has called up performers? Okay, After Forever, Blind Guardian, Dream Theater, Avantasia, Epica, Camelot, Nightwish, Godhard, Iron Maiden, Lacuna Coil, Rhapsody of Fire, Within Temptation, The Flower Kings, Yes, King Crimson, and even Genesis. And really, I left a whole slew of smaller acts off of that list. That's how much clout Arion has. And, you know, it's kind of incredible how he can call up so many different prog and metal performers to work with him time and time again, and yet have them produce something that's not only quality, but actually pretty damn coherent and surprisingly effective. But for those of you who don't know, the Ayreon project had its concluding element was 010110001, the binary term for Y in 2008, with Arion finally deciding to set it aside to go on to other projects, like the follow-up to the Star One album, and the fascinating experimentation with Guilt Machine, which was an act I really liked. Yet this year, he announced that he was calling together a whole new crop of musicians to come work with him on an album titled The Theory of Everything. And as an Ayreon fan and a graduate from a physics program, I was more than intrigued by what Arion was going to be able to create from his insane vision and fetish for weird science. Now, all joking aside, this has been my most highly anticipated album of the year thus far. So, did he pull off another classic with The Theory of Everything? Well, to be completely honest, I'm not sure that I'm the critic you should be asking on this subject. Now, let me explain this. It's been a policy of mine to always fully articulate my own personal biases and my own preferences before I deliver a review. And with that in mind, I don't think I can be nearly as objective as I'd like to be with The Theory of Everything. And strangely enough, it doesn't have anything to do with me being an Ayreon fan. No. This time it has to do with the subject matter, which we'll discuss in a little bit. For the moment, however, this album gets an immediate recommendation. Seriously, you all need to go out and buy this album as soon as you possibly can. And while I'm not quite sure it's Ayreon's best, it's pretty damn close. Now, the first thing that I'd like to qualify when talking about this album is that whoever decided to split this album into 42 distinctive tracks needs to get smacked, because without a bit of personal remixing, there are audible thuds between each individual piece on this album. Now, this album is meant to be heard as 4 20-minute long pieces, with the additional breakdown coming in through the transitions, which are masterfully done and don't require additional physical track splitting. Now, don't blame Arion for this. In fact, I'll probably place the majority of the blame on the label. But that being said, I'm not entirely surprised why it was done. After all, labels get antsy when they see songs longer than 20 minutes, even on prog albums. But at the same time, after I had remixed the album back into a 4-track state and smoothed out the transitions, The Theory of Everything flowed a lot better. Of course, then the issue becomes that there isn't the same single potential. But then again, I'd argue that's just fine. If you took segments out of the larger piece, out of the larger tracks on this album, sure, you'd have solid enough singles, but they lose something without the larger context of the album behind them, which is both a strength for the cohesiveness of the work as a whole, and a bit of a weakness for not quite being able to replicate the distinctive song standouts like Day 11 Love from The Human Equation, or River of Time, or Beneath the Waves, or Connect Dots from Y. Now, the point that I'm laboriously trying to make here is that the album is meant to be listened through in 4 large tracks, and each of them are fantastic, uniquely defined by their own sounds and musical motifs that stretch throughout each piece, plus the album as a whole. Everybody, and I mean everybody that Arion has brought in, is at their absolute best here, and no performer feels remotely out of place. I will say this album has the distinctive Ayreon sound, plus a little bit of a couple elements from Guilt Machine. I picked up on those. But as I've mentioned before, that's not a bad thing because Arion innovates enough with his chord progressions and his choices in instrumentation to give this album, and indeed all of his albums, their own unique sound. In this case, his integration of more modern synths are damn near perfect, and the choice to bring in Troy Donockley from Nightwish adds a whole new layer of flavor to this album that I really did enjoy. On top of that, there's a stronger symphonic bent on this album that does wonders for adding additional dramatic weight and atmosphere to the story as a whole. And putting aside my own personal connection to said story, it's arguably a story that requires all the additional support from the instrumentation that it can get. Now, here's where we're going to have to talk about the story and distinctive themes of this album, which is reasonably simple, yet good enough and with enough twists that I don't want to spoil too much. Basically, it's a cross between Good Will Hunting, Limitless, and The Social Network in terms of story, character, and themes, and it really appropriates the best elements of all 3. But it's also here that I'm going to have to qualify any sort of criticisms or praise that I deliver, because stories about possibly autistic young men dealing with genius and impossible dreams, particularly in the field of physics, the consumption of drugs that are used to clear somebody's mind, and the implications about prescribing said drugs, all interwoven with heartbreakingly complicated relationship with the said genius's parents and especially his father. Yeah, there's no way I can possibly be completely objective when it comes to talking about these, particularly considering how much they just resonated with me on a very emotional level. What I can say is this: Arion does an astoundingly good job framing this story as a whole, giving all of his characters very human motivations and emotional responses, and not really casting any one character as a villain per se, or at least not a villain that's entirely black-hearted. And his singers, they do their absolute damnedest to sell that story as a whole. And you know what? I can't deny how much it really did get to me. But that being said, there are a few points that I'd like to discuss further. The first surrounding the overall concept of the album. Now, I'm not the first person who has said that Arion's material might be better suited to the stage or to film rather than to just music. And it's a credit to how good Arion is at evoking emotions and images through his instrumentation and lyrics that he manages to get by and produce such incredibly strong albums. But with that in mind, though, the core story of this album revolves around solving the theory of everything, a series of physics equations that involves the unification of all of the fundamental forces into one mathematical model. In essence, it's a story about people thinking and scribbling out equations in theoretical physics, and coming from that background, there aren't many ways to make that compelling to a mainstream audience on any level. That's one of the reasons that I really appreciate the grand symphonic backdrop that Arion incorporated into his story, because it lends dramatic weight to the actual tale that it desperately needs. And here's where Arion makes his best decision with the theory of everything, and it's linked to a big problem whenever people attempt to make art out of science. Now, it can tend to either go one of two ways. You have the technobabble approach, where science concepts are bastardized into important sounding words but show that the artist doesn't really understand or care about the concept. Or you get what I'm going to call the primer approach, where the science and complex terminology is preserved and understood by the artist, but not always presented in an emotionally compelling way outside of the puzzle of it all, so that the audience might not understand the concepts of which the artist is trying to discuss with them. Now, it's no surprise that Hollywood tends to go with the former because, let's face it, it's more easy to dumb down to a mainstream demographic. But there's a third path, and it's what I like to call the social network approach, using the science and the complex terminology as a framing device for grounded human drama. The social network on the surface might be about the founding of Facebook, to be sure, but the emotional undercurrents and conflicts are presented in such a compelling manner. The founding of a website takes a backseat to the real human drama underneath it all. And that's what Arion does with the theory of everything. It's not about the theories or the physics or the complicated terminology. It's about the father-son dynamic, the rivalry between geniuses, the risks of mind-altering and mind-expanding drugs, and parental responsibility in the administration of those drugs, and the obsessiveness of men seeking deep primeval truths that could destroy them. These are powerful, epic, big idea themes that Arion tackles masterfully, only barely even touching on the scientific jargon of it all, for the most part. There are a few isolated points throughout the first and fourth tracks that did feel like science words and elementary particles and theories were included almost for their own sake or just to fit the rhyme scheme, and I gotta be honest, that did annoy me. But then again, I think I might be one of the few people who actually notices that element, so I'm guessing most people won't care. A bigger problem, however, comes in through some of the writing on this album, in that it's a little bit underwritten. Now, this didn't bother me as much. The instrumentation did a good job stimulating my imagination, so I was easily able to understand the scene from how Arion wrote it, and I would prefer this approach to free-flowing jargon word salad any day. But I can see where some people could get lost, particularly if they can't empathize with any of the underlying themes of the story. This is most an issue with the fourth track of the album, because the story, by necessity, refocuses on the solving of the equation. Some of the human drama along the way doesn't always carry over as well, outside of the principal themes, that is. And yeah, sure, those themes are definitely compelling, but if you're not on board with the themes from the very start, you're not gonna be sticking along for the ride in the fourth track. And even then, the themes aren't as well articulated or have the same level of nuance, at least at the level of the first three tracks. And on that note, I can't say that I'm the biggest fan of the album's ending either. Arion has a bit of a habit of ending his albums on slightly odd or off-kilter notes, and The Theory of Everything is no exception. If I'm going to criticize this ending without spoiling it per se, it feels a bit abortive and unnecessarily mysterious. Yes, there were tragic consequences in the solving of the theory, but I don't think that the emotional follow-up lands the emotional punch as effectively, particularly in considering with the parallelism between the father's fate and the son's fate. I don't know. Maybe it's because I heard Higgs Boson Blues by Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds earlier this year, and that song did that follow-up to world-changing discovery in physics so damn well. I was just a little bit underwhelmed by that Arion didn't take that next step quite as far. He does take that next step, but he doesn't quite go as far as he could have, and that kind of got on my nerves. Yet all that being said, The Theory of Everything by Ayreon is one of the best goddamn albums of the year, and it cannot get a higher recommendation from me. Is it perfect? No, but what is? Every single vocalist, even from Lacuna Coil and Nightwish, is at their absolute peak, delivering a story that really got to me on an emotional level that I wasn't expecting or predicting at all, and it has the unique instrumental and compositional genius to back it up. I cannot stress to you how much you should get this album as soon as you can, because it gets a 9 out of 10 without question, and despite the harshness of some of my criticisms on the story, it's within spitting distance of a 10. If you have somebody in your life who loves science, or is way too smart for his own good, or who's potentially autistic, get them this album, and then get it for yourself, because it is just that great, and really, after everything Arion's been doing in the industry, he deserves the support. And Arion, if you happen to stumble across this video, and who knows, that might happen, well, you did something special with this one, man, and I can't thank you enough for it. So yeah, if you'd like to like and subscribe, thanks a lot for watching, I really do appreciate it. If there's anything I might be able to do to improve my overall presentation, or if there's any other albums you'd like me to check out, I'd be more than happy to take a listen. Until then, see you next time.